February 9th, 1945. Luzon Strait, midway between the northern Philippines and Formosa. The sea that night was black and heavy. The submarine USS Batfish, a Balao-class boat under Lieutenant Commander John K. Fife, was running her surface patrol, radar sweeping the cluttered water ahead. Inside the control room, the air was metallic, dense with oil and humidity. Every few seconds, the SJ radar pulsed, and the scope's thin green line rolled in a circle. At 10:18 p.m., a faint return blinked. Range 8 miles, bearing 210. Too small for a destroyer, too steady for drift or sea clutter. It didn't fit a convoy pattern. Fife leaned over the radar repeater, eyes narrowed. "Mark it," he said quietly. The plot began to form, tiny pencil marks on a grease board, each one a pulse echo turned into position. The contact was moving slowly, 5 to 6 knots, erratic course changes every few minutes. Fife didn't need a chart to guess what it was. A Japanese submarine, surfaced to recharge batteries, unaware that an American boat was listening. For months, intelligence from Guam had shown enemy subs using the same narrow shipping lanes between Formosa and Luzon to shuttle code material and personnel. It was supposed to be safe water. Tonight, it wasn't. Down in the sonar shack, Petty Officer Harold Carney adjusted the gain knobs of the QB sonar set. A soft hiss filled his headphones, the ocean's constant static. Then, beneath it, something faint and regular. A deep thump, exactly 5 times per rotation. "Contact bearing 210, slow screws," he called. "Probably diesel-electric, sir." Fife didn't answer right away. He was doing the math in his head. Bearing, closure rate, intercept angle. Then he said simply, "Keep him." Radar showed the target closing, range now 7 miles. The Batfish slowed to 5 knots, electric motors humming quietly under battery power. The night periscope rose, slicing through the rain, nothing but darkness and whitecaps. Fife brought it down and gave the next order. "Rig for silent running. We'll go below." The hull creaked as the ballast tanks flooded. The control room lights dimmed to red. Depth 40 feet, 50. Sonar grew sharper as surface noise faded away. The operators worked by instinct, tuning for the rhythmic pattern that separated man-made machinery from the sea's random voices. Each submarine class had its own acoustic fingerprint. The Japanese RO class used 5-bladed propellers that made a low, deliberate pulse, recognizable even through thermoclines. Carney recognized it now. 5 blades, 200 RPM, definitely a sub. Fife's plan wasn't standard doctrine. Submarines were supposed to hunt on the surface and attack merchant convoys, not other subs. Engaging another submarine at night, using radar and sonar together, was considered impossible. But Batfish had been testing new coordination procedures. Radar for range, sonar for bearing, both plotted into the torpedo data computer. The concept came from the Navy's evaluation group back in Pearl. Integrated targeting through instruments, not instinct. Fife had read every report and believed in the math. At 10:43 p.m., the contact vanished from radar. "He's diving," Fife said. "Hold sonar contact." The soundmen followed the echo as it dropped deeper, 100 feet, then 120. The Japanese skipper, thinking he'd been spotted by aircraft radar, was trying to hide beneath the thermal layer. Fife ordered Batfish to periscope depth and trimmed ballast to stay just above that layer. Sound waves bent sharply at the temperature change. By staying above it, the American sonar could still hear clearly, while the enemy's set went nearly blind. The sonar bearings shifted slightly to the left. "He's turning north," Carney whispered. Fife watched the grease pencil marks creep across the plotting board. Each new bearing meant a new line of motion. After 4 readings, the target's course emerged, northwest, about 300 degrees. Speed unchanged. Range roughly 2,000 yards. Fife ordered the bow tubes flooded. It was now a geometry problem, not a guess. The sonar operator called out bearing updates every 30 seconds. The fire control party used them to compute target track and speed. The torpedo data computer, a maze of brass gears and spinning gyros, converted those inputs into a gyro angle for the torpedo's steering fins. Every number mattered. A 2-degree error could mean a miss by hundreds of feet. Fife trusted his crew. "Match bearings and shoot," he said. At 11:12 p.m., Batfish fired 2 Mark 18 electric torpedoes. They left the tubes silently, no bubbles, no wake. The seconds ticked off in the control room. 55, 56, 57. Then a deep concussion rolled through the hull. The sonar trace broke apart in metallic screeches, then faded. Carney took off his headphones and rubbed his ears. "Echo gone," he said quietly. "Oil coming up, sir." On the surface above them, the sea boiled with debris, fragments of teak, a dark slick spreading in the rain. Batfish held depth, listening for counterattack. None came. Fife entered the position in the logbook. 19 degrees 1 minute north, 121 degrees 44 minutes east. "Target sunk," he wrote. That was all. No celebration followed. They'd seen too many patrols end with silence. But this one felt different. The method had worked exactly as predicted. Radar contact, sonar handoff, triangulation, firing solution. The first submarine ever sunk by another submarine using sonar bearings alone. 2 nights later, it happened again. Another contact, same bearing, same slow screws. Another Japanese boat running the same route under identical orders. Batfish repeated the same pattern: surface detection, submergence sonar tracking, torpedo launch. Another explosion, another silent patch of ocean. Fife gathered his officers in the wardroom afterward. "We're not guessing anymore," he said. "We're measuring." His voice was flat, tired. "Let's keep doing it by the numbers." What he didn't know yet was that the Japanese command in Tokyo, puzzled by 3 missing submarines in a single patrol lane, would soon transmit a search order to a 4th boat. It would meet the same fate. In 76 hours, Batfish would sink 3 submarines in one of the most improbable streaks in naval history. Not through luck or chance, but through sound, discipline, and the quiet precision of American engineering. That night, as the crew settled into their narrow bunks, the sonar shack stayed manned. The men listened to the faint pulse of the sea, waiting for another contact. Nothing came, just the slow, steady ping of their own system echoing back from a world they were learning, hour by hour, to hear. By dawn on February 13, 1945, the Batfish had been submerged nearly 12 hours, running silent below the gray surface of the Luzon Strait. The crew moved carefully through the narrow passageways, speaking in low voices. They had made 3 attacks in as many nights and destroyed 3 enemy submarines, each tracked, targeted, and hit through sound alone. Yet there was no celebration, not even conversation. The inside of a submarine after days underwater was a strange place. Quiet, stale, filled with the vibration of machinery and the smell of diesel and sweat. Men learned not to talk about what they had seen or what they'd heard. Lieutenant Commander John Fife stood near the periscope well, hands clasped behind his back, eyes on the sonar repeaters. The sound was faint. Only the distant thrum of the Batfish's own propellers and the occasional ping as they checked their range from the seabed. The sonar team, Carney and his assistant McKenna, had logged every minute of the engagements: 3 sonar contacts, 3 successful triangulations, 3 explosions heard through the hull. Their grease pencil logs looked almost identical, each one a rhythm of bearings and timestamps, steady drift left, speed constant, then silence. The pattern was so consistent it felt mathematical, and that was exactly how Fife liked it. When Batfish finally surfaced near midday, the sky was the color of unpolished steel. The radar operator ran the SJ scope, sweeping for aircraft. Nothing. The sea around them was flat and empty. A light breeze carried the faint odor of oil, and something burnt. Debris at bearing 095, the lookout reported. They motored closer at 10 knots. Fragments of teak, splintered hull pieces, and the gleam of a metal cylinder, oxygen bottles maybe, floated on the surface. Fife ordered a course change. No recovery. "Mark position only," he said. The ocean had already written its report. Below deck, the engines roared to life again, charging the batteries. Chief Machinist's mate Henry Kimbrough watched the dials steady into the green and nodded. The boat felt alive once more, humming with steady power. In the wardroom, Fife sat with his exec, Lieutenant Red Gleason, going over the sonar and radar logs. They were looking for one thing: consistency. "It's not luck," Fife said. "It's geometry." "We caught them by the numbers." That phrase, "by the numbers," was becoming a quiet motto aboard the submarine service. For decades, underwater warfare had been more art than science. Skippers relied on instinct, timing, and luck. But in 1945, instinct was giving way to mathematics. The tools that had made Batfish's victories possible, radar, sonar, analog computers, were the product of laboratories as much as fleet experience. Fife's own method, the seamless handoff between radar and sonar, was being tested at the Navy's Submarine Operational Evaluation Group in Washington. They called it Integrated Fire Control, and few captains were willing to trust it in real combat. Fife had just proven it worked. The equipment aboard Batfish wasn't unique. Every Balao-class submarine carried the same instruments: the SJ radar for surface range, the SV radar for air search, and the QB series sonar for underwater tracking. The key was how they were used. Radar gave range, but not depth. Sonar gave bearing, but not distance. The two systems spoke different languages, and before 1944, they were rarely synchronized. Fife's crew, trained at Pearl, learned to translate between them. They timed their radar sweeps to the sonar bearings, matching movement patterns in real time. The fire control team fed those numbers into the Mark III torpedo data computer, a mechanical brain of brass wheels and differentials that could calculate where the target would be by the time the torpedo arrived. What sounded abstract on paper was deadly precise in the field. Sonar could detect a submarine's propeller at 2,000 yards. Radar could confirm range down to a few dozen. Every few seconds, Carney's voice echoed through the control room. "Bearing 210, closing slowly." Then a pause. "Bearing drifting right." "He's turning." The TDC operator spun dials, recalculating gyro angles for each torpedo. When Fife gave the order to fire, it wasn't instinct, it was data. The torpedo's path was plotted, checked, and verified by sound. For the Japanese submarines, it was incomprehensible. Their own sonar was primitive, a low-frequency Type 93 system that could pick up destroyers or merchant ships, but not a low-noise submarine. Their radar receivers were unreliable, often giving vague warnings of signal without direction. To them, Batfish was invisible, a ghost that appeared out of nowhere and struck from darkness. Post-war diaries from surviving Japanese crews described enemy subs with ears of steel. They were right. Meanwhile, halfway across the Pacific, in the laboratories that had built those ears, The engineers were already studying the Batfish reports. At the Navy's Underwater Sound Laboratory in New London, Connecticut, technicians tested new ceramic crystals for transducers, barium titanate, and lead zirconate, materials that could convert electrical pulses into clean sound waves under extreme pressure. Every frequency mattered. 10 kilohertz for long range, 15 for clarity, 20 for precision tracking. When those frequencies aligned with the salinity and temperature of a given ocean layer, sonar echoes became sharper, steadier, and unmistakably human-made. In Washington, at the Naval Research Laboratory, physicists were analyzing how temperature gradients bent those sound waves, creating shadow zones where sonar failed. They built mathematical tables that allowed operators like Carney to predict when an echo was being distorted by thermoclines. Fife had used those principles instinctively during the Batfish attacks, keeping his boat just above the layer where sound traveled fastest, ensuring his sonar could hear while the enemies went blind. He may not have known the equations, but he understood the logic. Control the medium, and you control the battle. What made Batfish's patrol extraordinary wasn't just 3 kills, it was what those kills represented. The boat had done what doctrine said was impossible. A submarine finding, tracking, and sinking another submarine underwater, at night, using no visual contact. Before February 1945, that had never happened successfully in the Pacific. Submarines were hunters of surface ships, not of their own kind. Now, for the first time, sound alone was a weapon. When Batfish returned to Fremantle, Australia, weeks later, the Navy's Operational Evaluation Group took her logs and instruments apart piece by piece. They found nothing special. The hardware was standard issue. What differed was how it had been used. Fife's crew had trusted their instruments absolutely, treating them not as aids but as extensions of their own senses. In the sonar shack, Carney later said, "You didn't just listen. You lived inside the sound." But in February 1945, before anyone knew they'd made history, the men of Batfish just kept to their watch rotations. Carney and McKenna in the sonar room, the radar operator checking his scope every 15 minutes, engineers tending to the generators. The method had become routine. Find, track, fire. Listen for the echo of destruction. Fife's tone never changed. "Do it by the numbers," he reminded them. And they did. Above them, the war was nearing its end. Japan's surface navy had been shattered. Its merchant fleet was down to a fraction of its former strength. The U.S. submarine force, once scattered and uncertain, now controlled every major sea lane. What Batfish had shown was the logical culmination of that transformation, the point where technology, training, and nerve combined into something almost mechanical. Still, deep below those gray waves, the silence after a kill was never peaceful. The sound crew sat with their headphones on, waiting for a new echo that might never come. Hours passed. Then days. Nothing but the endless hiss of the ocean and the slow hum of machinery. The sonar pinged once, faint and distant. Carney tilted his head, listening. "Negative contact," he said finally. "Probably a whale." He wrote the time in the log, erased the grease board, and leaned back in his chair. The war at sea was ending not with explosions, but with silence, and the quiet triumph of men who had learned to hear through it. Before sonar became a weapon, it was a laboratory experiment, one that barely worked. In the early years of the war, the United States had depended heavily on British research, using ASDIC sets that could send out a single tone and wait for an echo. They were crude, fragile, and easily fooled by weather, whales, or the sound of a ship's own screws. But by 1943, the science of sound had become an industry, and that industry was spread across a string of American towns: New London, Keyport, Anacostia, and Cambridge, where physicists and machinists worked side by side to solve what they called the acoustic problem. How to hear in an ocean built to swallow sound. The Navy's underwater sound laboratory in New London was at the center of it. It had begun as a small annex with a single test pier and a handful of concrete buildings on the Thames River. By 1944, it housed more than 2,000 scientists, technicians, and draftsmen. Their tools weren't bombs or torpedoes. They were transducers, amplifiers, oscilloscopes, and hydrophones. Each component had to survive months of pressure, corrosion, and shock. The crystal at the heart of every sonar dome, the barium titanate disc, was only a few inches wide. Yet, it could turn an electric pulse into a focused beam that reached a mile through seawater. The early American systems, the Q series, then QHB and QBQ, were built for reliability. They operated between 10 and 30 kilohertz, a sweet spot between low-frequency range and high-frequency resolution. Operators could switch frequencies to match the conditions of the sea, low for deep water, high for the shallows. That flexibility was the quiet breakthrough that made sonar effective in every theater, from the North Atlantic to the Pacific. It wasn't glamorous, it was engineering. To test those systems, engineers flooded the docks of New London with experimental domes, steel, bronze, even rubber-coated aluminum. They tested each one by lowering it into the Thames and firing short pulses through the water, measuring the echo strength on paper tape. When they found a design that reduced noise by even a few decibels, they logged it, built another, and sent it to the field. Each improvement saved ships. The engineers learned that sound didn't move through water in straight lines. It bent, refracted, and folded over itself, changing speed with temperature and pressure. A layer of warm water could bounce sound downward like a mirror, hiding submarines below. A layer of cold water could bend it upward, creating false echoes near the surface. By studying these effects, the scientists learned to tune their sonar like musicians tuning instruments. One frequency for surface search, another for deep detection. The Navy called it variable frequency sonar. The sailors just called it the difference between life and death. In 1943, the first practical test came aboard destroyer escorts in the North Atlantic. Ships like the USS Batfish and USS Carteret carried the newest sets, QGB and QHB, and were ordered to hold contacts through evasive maneuvers. Their sonar crews spent hours listening to the same rhythm, a propeller's pulse, 5 beats per rotation, steady as a clock. They learned to tell a submarine from a freighter by tone alone. German U-boats with 4-blade screws produced a deeper hum. Allied destroyers, 5 or 6 blades, higher pitched and quicker. The best operators could identify a specific enemy class by sound. The lessons of the Atlantic flowed west. When the Pacific War reached its height in 1944, the Navy was installing sonar not just on destroyers, but on submarines, merchant ships, and even some Liberty ships. The philosophy was simple: fill the ocean with ears. A single destroyer escort could now protect 2 convoys instead of 1. Each new sonar set was a node in a growing web of underwater awareness, a listening grid that stretched from Newfoundland to the Solomons. For the men who built these systems, victory didn't look like a battle won. It looked like a quieter ocean. In New London, machinists who had never seen combat received telegrams from the fleet. QHB-3 performed flawlessly. Contact held at 2,000 yards through 2 turns. Sunk enemy sub. Those messages hung on bulletin boards like trophies. Every improvement mattered. Stronger crystals, better amplifiers, a cleaner signal line. When a unit failed, the engineers traced it down to a solder joint or a nicked cable, then redesigned it. The war wasn't fought just with bullets. It was fought with resistance charts and frequency graphs. The production network behind sonar was staggering. Companies like Western Electric, RCA, and General Electric built thousands of transducers each month. The Bureau of Ships sent out blueprints, and factories in New Jersey and Ohio turned them into instruments capable of surviving pressure 600 feet below. Each sonar set contained over 200 precision components. The Navy demanded that every one be inspected, tested, and shipped within 48 hours. The result was a machine so dependable that sailors began to trust sound more than sight. Back aboard the Batfish, that trust had become second nature. Harold Carney, the sonar operator, could tell by the pitch of the echo whether the target was turning, diving, or surfacing. "You can feel it before you hear it," he said later. "A sub trying to run silent still moves water. You can sense it in your bones." His training had been brutal. 12 weeks of endless listening drills, 8-hour watches, and constant requalification. The sonar shack was small, red-lit, and lined with sweating metal. The men worked barefoot to feel vibration through the deck. Every movement, every adjustment of the gain knob could decide whether a contact was real or imagined. The first time Carney heard a submarine's breakup noises after Batfish's second kill, he didn't celebrate. He just logged it. Echo faded rapidly, probable hull failure. The sound had a texture, like a groan followed by snapping glass. It wasn't the sound of victory, it was the sound of physics. In Washington, Navy analysts compared those same sound logs to the laboratory data from New London. The pattern matched: the echo delay, the fading frequency curve, the harmonic decay of collapsing steel. For the first time, the scientists could quantify what a sinking submarine sounded like. That data would later form the basis for post-war acoustic identification and, eventually, the Cold War's SOSUS network that listened to the entire Atlantic. But in 1945, it was still new, and it was changing the way sailors understood the ocean. Every sonar operator knew the truth that the engineers were still proving on paper. Sound was the most faithful witness in war. Radar could lie, sight could fail, but sound, if understood, never did. By early 1945, the U.S. Navy had launched more than 10,000 sonar-equipped vessels. The Germans had nothing comparable. The Japanese, even less. Their hydrophones could detect destroyers at a mile or two, but nothing like the precision of the American systems. As the Allies gained acoustic dominance, the ocean itself seemed to switch sides. When Batfish's patrol ended, her sonar dome was pulled for inspection at Fremantle. Technicians found it scoured by sand and salt, but still within calibration. The transducer crystal, small, round, fragile, was unbroken. It had heard perfectly through every engagement. One engineer reportedly held it up and said, "That little disk is worth 3 submarines." That was the quiet truth of the war at sea. Victories weren't won by chance or bravery alone, but by thousands of unnoticed improvements in sound. The crazy night-hunting method that Fife had used in the Luzon Strait was the culmination of all those refinements, a human ear sharpened by engineering. In the years to come, sonar would evolve into complex arrays and digital processors, but the principle remained the same. Sound, when mastered, reveals what the eye can't. In 1945, it was a new idea. By the war's end, it was the difference between surviving and vanishing into silence. When Batfish finally eased into Fremantle Harbor after 78 days at sea, her gray hull streaked with salt and oil. The crew looked like they'd come back from another planet. Men moved stiffly along the deck, unshaven, eyes squinting against daylight after weeks of red lamps and dim compartments. A tug came alongside, tossing up a line. There was no brass band, no camera crew, just a few officers from Submarine Squadron 16 waiting with clipboards. One of them waved Fife over as the mooring lines went taut. "Washington wants your sonar logs immediately," he said. Fife nodded, handed over a canvas pouch, and stepped back aboard. Inside those logs was something the Navy had never seen before. A step-by-step record of 3 submarine kills made at night, underwater, without visual contact. The sonar operators had recorded every bearing shift, every echo return, every second between ping and detonation. The raw data filled 47 pages of handwritten notes and grease pencil diagrams. It didn't look like history, but it was. Within weeks, analysts at the Navy's Submarine Operational Evaluation Group in Washington were poring over the material. They reconstructed the geometry of each engagement, plotting the radar range, sonar bearings, and torpedo tracks onto transparent overlays. When the diagrams lined up, the pattern was unmistakable. Each attack followed the same mathematical rhythm: radar contact, target dive, sonar triangulation, torpedo launch, explosion, and echo fade. The entire process, detect, track, engage, had been achieved through instruments alone. The evaluators gave it a name: Coordinated Radar Sonar Fire Control. Fleet officers simply called it the Batfish method. At first, senior commanders were skeptical. Many had spent their careers believing submarine versus submarine warfare was impractical. Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of the Pacific Submarine Force, had once said flatly that no sub will ever catch another submerged. But Batfish's logs were irrefutable. The kill positions matched known Japanese loss reports. The acoustic signatures confirmed direct hits. The probability of coincidence was near zero. A week later, the Bureau of Ordnance issued a confidential circular to all fleet submarine captains. Sonar radar coordinated attacks recommended. Procedures per USS Batfish patrol analysis. The circular read like an instruction manual, but between the lines was something more profound: a shift in doctrine. For the first time, sonar wasn't just for defense. It was a weapon. Crews were trained to use it aggressively, maintaining contact through dives, calculating firing solutions from bearing drift, trusting the math over instinct. Radar was no longer the only eye in the dark. Sound had become equal to sight. The analysis teams found something else in the Batfish logs that astonished them: the precision of the crew's timing. Every 30 seconds, sonar bearings had been logged. Every course change recorded to the degree. Fife's crew had built their own feedback loop, checking the fire control computer's solution against the rhythm of the target's propeller beats. When the cadence shifted, they adjusted. It was analog automation before the word existed. To confirm the system's validity, the Navy ran controlled tests off Key West in the spring of 1945. The submarine Rasher acted as hunter, the old training boat S-20 as the target. Using Batfish's procedures, Rasher was able to acquire, track, and sink the target in under an hour, without surfacing or using a periscope. The observer's report called it a complete revolution in underwater tactics. At New London, the results reached the engineers who had built the sonar sets in the first place. One memo from March 1945 simply said, "Batfish reports confirm QHB acoustic resolution sufficient for engagement fire control." To the scientists, that single sentence meant everything. Their fragile ceramic discs and amplifier circuits, their invisible work, had finally proven their worth. In an office overlooking the Thames River, a physicist named Charles Sitterly taped a newspaper clipping to the wall. U.S. submarine sinks 3 enemy subs in 76 hours. Under it, he wrote in pencil, "They heard them first." Back at sea, the Batfish's example began to spread. Other skippers tried variations of the method, using radar to find convoys, then slipping under to track escorting submarines through sonar. It wasn't always successful. The conditions had to be perfect, and few crews had the same discipline as Fifes. But the idea stuck. In fleet briefings, instructors started drawing sonar range diagrams next to torpedo triangles. The vocabulary of submarine warfare had changed. Fife himself was uneasy with the attention. In interviews years later, he downplayed the achievement. It wasn't genius, he said. It was training, luck, and a lot of listening. But his crew knew better. They'd spent 76 hours balancing on the edge of silence, trusting equations scrawled on a board more than their instincts. They'd proven that the ocean could be measured, predicted, and hunted through. Washington's reports on the Batfish patrol eventually reached the highest levels of command. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, wrote a short endorsement in April 1945. Results of coordinated sonar radar operations validate continued development of acoustic fire control. Recommend integration into post-war designs. Those designs would become the blueprint for every Cold War submarine fleet. What began as an experiment in one boat's control room now reshaped naval architecture. Future submarines would have their sonar rooms moved closer to the conning tower, their data feeds wired directly into fire control. The term passive detection would evolve into acoustic targeting. The men who had once listened with headphones would soon be replaced by entire arrays of sensors built into the hull, computers translating echoes into maps of motion. But in 1945, it still came down to men like Carney, leaning forward in red light, catching the faint pulse of another life moving through water. For the sonar operators, each sound told a story. The steady hum of their own engines meant safety. The rising whine of cavitation meant danger. And when the echo stopped, it meant finality. It wasn't glory, Carney said later. It was quiet work. You don't see what happens, you just hear it end. That quiet work was what had turned the tide in the Atlantic, and now was finishing the job in the Pacific. For years, Allied ships had been the hunted. By 1945, they were the predators. And they owed that reversal not just to courage, but to those invisible pulses traveling through the deep. Each one a question. Who's out there? Each time the ocean answered, the war got shorter. In the spring of 1945, as the Batfish crew rested in Fremantle and the last convoys steamed toward Okinawa, something subtle was happening inside the Navy's hierarchy. The age of the big gun was ending, and the age of the signal was beginning. Engineers, and commanders alike were starting to understand that whoever could hear first, whether it was an aircraft over radar or a submarine through sonar, would win before the first shot was ever fired. In the Pacific, that truth had been proven by one submarine's patrol. But in Washington, it was about to become policy. The Naval Research Laboratory began assembling a classified report titled Acoustic Detection in Offensive Operations, using Batfish's data as the central case. The report's conclusion was concise and almost prophetic. Sound, properly interpreted, constitutes vision beneath the sea. For a Navy that had spent decades fighting blind underwater, it was as if someone had switched on a light. The lessons of Batfish spread quickly. Fleet Submarine Training Command added new modules to its curriculum. Courses on hydroacoustic propagation, frequency modulation, and bearing error correction. Sonar operators learned not just to recognize noise, but to understand it. How warm layers bent pings upward. How salinity could distort range. How propeller harmonics could betray a vessel's identity. These weren't theoretical lessons, they were survival skills. Out at sea, every submarine now carried a miniature sound library, metal discs engraved with recorded propeller patterns of enemy ships, known as Graham records. Operators could compare live echoes to these samples, identifying a contact by ear. The sea had become a language, and every screw, hull, and wave had its dialect. But behind the training and tactics was something deeper, a quiet revolution in how the Navy thought about machines and men. In the years before the war, submarines were often designed around hardware, engines, torpedoes, and steel. After Batfish, the focus shifted to information. The next generation of boats would be built around sensors. The hull would become an ear. The control room would become a brain. And the crew would be trained not just to fight, but to listen. That transformation began in the laboratories. Western Electric refined its sonar amplifiers, cutting background noise by 20 decibels. Bell Labs developed the first continuous range recorders, which turned sonar echoes into real-time line graphs. The Navy's acoustic engineers built long cylindrical test tanks where they fired pings through layers of temperature-controlled seawater, studying how sound curved with pressure. These were the birthplaces of a new kind of warfare, one that measured victory in microseconds and decibels instead of tonnage and range. The results of those efforts were visible by war's end. By August 1945, the U.S. Navy's sonar systems could identify a submerged submarine at over 4,000 yards, track it while maneuvering, and compute firing solutions with better than 90% accuracy. The Japanese, by contrast, could barely detect a destroyer beyond 1,500 yards. It wasn't just superiority in arms, it was superiority in understanding. The shift was so fundamental that even before the war ended, the Navy began planning how to extend it into peace. The question wasn't how to fight, but how to listen farther. In 1946, the Office of Naval Research launched Project Jezebel, a continuation of wartime acoustic research. Scientists discovered something extraordinary. Deep in the Atlantic lay a natural sound channel, a layer of water where sound waves could travel thousands of miles with little loss. By placing hydrophones along that channel, the Navy could hear ships and submarines across oceans. It was the seed that would grow into the SOSUS network, the sound surveillance system, an invisible web that, by the Cold War, could track Soviet submarines from Newfoundland to Norway. The core technology of SOSUS, the hydrophone arrays, the amplifiers, the signal analyzers, all traced their lineage back to the compact sonar dome under Batfish's bow. The same principles, the same frequencies, the same logic. Fife's crew had shown that precision and patience could turn sound into sight. Engineers simply scaled it up until the entire ocean could be heard. In the Navy's archives today, the official Batfish report is unassuming. 50 pages of typed text, diagrams, and graphs. But to those who know what they're looking at, it marks a threshold, the moment when the undersea world stopped being a mystery. Every sonar operator who came after was working inside the echo of that patrol. For the men who lived it, though, the meaning was simpler. Years later, when interviewed for the Submarine Veterans Association, sonar operator Harold Carney said, "We didn't know we were making history. We were just doing what the instruments told us." He smiled, then added, "And they were right every time." John Fife retired from the Navy not long after the war. He rarely spoke about the Batfish Patrol, and when he did, he said the same thing, that it proved the ocean could be understood if you respected it enough to listen. There's something timeless in that idea. Long before satellites or digital systems, before screens and data feeds, the ocean had already been mapped. By sound, by patience, by human attention. The war had started with guesswork and ended with precision. Between those 2 points lay the quiet genius of thousands of unknown men. Engineers who tuned crystals by hand, sailors who memorized the rhythm of propellers, and captains who trusted equations in the dark. what happened aboard Batfish in February 1945 wasn't just a victory. It was the moment when technology crossed the line from tool to teacher, when sound itself became strategy, when listening became seeing. And that's how a single submarine, in 76 hours, changed the way the world fought beneath the sea forever. In the quiet that followed the war, the oceans seemed to return to stillness. Ships moved again for trade instead of combat. Sonar pings that once hunted lives now measured depth, fish, and coastline. But for the men who had spent those years inside steel hulls, the sea never sounded the same again. They remembered how the silence used to lie, how a calm ocean could hide movement like a breath held too long, and how, once they had learned to listen, that same silence revealed everything. When Batfish was decommissioned in 1946, she was just another tired submarine in a navy that suddenly had too many. Her gray paint was faded, her sonar dome scarred, her instruments outdated by newer, faster, deeper diving designs. But her name, quietly, had already become legend. In submarine schools across the United States, her patrol reports were read line by line, her sonar diagrams studied as if they were blueprints to thought itself. Cadets learned that under pressure and darkness, the difference between confusion and clarity came down to discipline, not luck. For the engineers who had built her equipment, Batfish was proof that theory could save lives. In post-war interviews, one of the Bell Labs designers who worked on her QHB sonar said, "We never saw the enemy, but we knew our circuits heard him." That was enough. He kept a tiny piece of a barium titanate crystal on his desk for decades afterward. A reminder, he said, that something small can change an ocean. In the decades that followed, the same technology that found submarines began to explore the planet itself. The early sonar maps of the 1950s revealed mountain ranges under the Atlantic, and trenches deeper than Everest was tall. Oceanography became possible because wartime sonar had made it measurable. What had once been a weapon turned into an instrument of knowledge. Yet, in every evolution, the core remained the same: sound as truth. The Cold War inherited the echoes of Batfish. Sonar rooms grew larger, the displays brighter, the calculations faster. But the act itself never changed. Somewhere in every submarine, a man still sat in the dark, headphones on, waiting for a faint pulse to return. In his world, time was measured not by minutes, but by milliseconds. Not by what he saw, but by what he heard. If you walk the decks of the preserved USS Batfish today, now resting on display in Muskogee, Oklahoma, you can still see the small circular window where her sonar dome once fed its signals inside. It's an unremarkable shape, 6 inches of glass behind a tangle of wires, but that little opening was once an ear to the deep. Visitors pass it without a glance. They look instead at the torpedo tubes, the bunks, the engines. Few realize that the real weapon on board wasn't steel or explosives. It was comprehension. In February 1945, the Batfish hunted 3 submarines it never saw, sank them all, and surfaced to silence. There were no photographs of the kills, no wreckage displayed, just 3 entries in a logbook and a series of echoes that faded into static. But in those echoes was the sound of something far greater, the moment when man learned to hear the ocean as clearly as he once feared it. That's what makes the Batfish story endure. It isn't about triumph in battle or technology for its own sake. It's about mastery born of patience, the kind of mastery that comes not from shouting into the void, but from listening until the void speaks back. And when it finally did, In that stretch of dark Pacific water in February 1945, the ocean whispered a truth humanity had never fully heard before. Nothing is truly hidden to those who learn how to listen. Thanks for listening till the end. I put a lot of effort to bring you factually correct and lesser-known stories of the past. Subscribe my channel if you like this type of content.